Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Accelerate Yale's first webinar. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on tech company recruiting with Andrew Meyer of Ripplematch. Before we get started with our discussion this evening, I wanted to introduce myself and just orient you a little bit to Zoom. My name is Wendy Maldonado D'Amico. I'm Yale class of 1993, and I'm part of the Accelerate Yale team. What I would like to first tell you is that this session is recorded, so keep that in mind. And I'm going to just orient you to the bottom buttons that you'll see on your screen here so that you know your way around Zoom. First, you'll see that there's a mute button. You don't have to worry about that as a participant because all of you are on mute. We also cannot see you, though you can see us. There's a stop video screen, which our speakers may want or need for whatever reason. I can see that right now we have 22 participants on the webinar, which is awesome, and that number is going to continue to climb over the course of the hour. Now, I'm going to show you something very important. It is the Q&A box. They look like little comment bubbles. If you have questions that you'd like to pose for Andrew this evening, please put your questions into that box and I will be moderating those questions and fielding those to him later. You can ignore the polls and share screens buttons. Another important button is the chat button. Now the chat button is really fun because this is where you can talk to each other as participants. I will be looking at that throughout the course of the session because sometimes questions do pop up in there, but I will ask you that if you want your question answered, that you've put it over in the Q&A boxes. But the chat is a great way to see who else is in the webinar right now and to also, talk to each other. And that too will be recorded, so just keep that in mind too. And then once the session is over at the top of the hour, I will end the meeting. Let's see here, what else did I want to tell you? So that's pretty much it. It's really easy. So what I'd like to do now is introduce one of the co-leaders of the Accelerate Yale team, who will be moderating the session tonight with Andrew. So I'd like to introduce Adam Brenner. He is one of the founding members of Accelerate Yale, and he is a partner at Perkins Coie in New York, and he's with the Emerging Company and Venture Capital group there. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Adam. Adam.
Great. Thank you, Wendy, for that. Thank you, Andrew, for being on this line. We're really excited to be launching these webinar series. We have some exciting topics coming up, including our next webinar next week already. But today, I actually thought it was really timely and exciting to loop in Andrew. Andrew is someone who's been a supporter of Accelerate Yale, and is just an active Yale alum. He's the CEO and co-founder of Ripplematch, which is a New York City tech startup committed to making college recruiting right for both students and employers. Ripplematch builds relationships with the best students on over 1,000 college campuses to help employers that care about building diverse, high-performing teams source the right candidates automatically. Since launching from Andrew's dorm room at Yale, Ripplematch has helped students from over 1,000 college campuses find jobs, raised over $10 million in venture funding, and brought on companies like Pfizer, Citadel, Yelp, and Dell as customers. In 2020, built in NYC, named Ripplematch was one of the best companies to work for in New York City. Andrew studied history at Yale, where he earned Phi Beta Kappa recognition before dropping out at the start of his senior year to build Ripplematch. Really excited to be speaking to Andrew today, and hope this is kind of an active discussion. So I guess to start out, Andrew, thank you for jumping on today. Tell us a little bit about how you founded Ripple, how you got to this moment in time.
Yeah, Adam, thanks so much for having me here. And it's great to be here with all of you tonight. I know all of us are probably looking for new things to do since we can't really go out and socialize in the evening. So I hope I can provide some substitute for the usual entertainment we're able to get during the weeks. But yeah, to answer Adam's question. So yeah, I mean, the kind of founding story with Ripplematch was we actually started the company in our Davenport dorm room. And I think the thing that was really on our minds was twofold. I think we were really aware of just some of the sort of societal inequities going on. I think we were really fortunate to be at Yale and have access to some great jobs kind of coming through the on-campus recruiting process. But For us, we were also really, I think, cognizant of the fact that the zip code that you're born in, the high school that you go to, all of these factors that happen on really early on in life have a huge impact on the school that you're able to get to. And not everybody kind of blooms at the same time as well. And so I think we were, number one, just concerned that the sort of school that you went to actually had a sort of disproportionate impact on the job that you ended up getting. And we were both, I think, really aware that there's a lot of amazing schools all over the country where the top candidates are, just as good as the top candidates at Harvard or the top candidates at Yale. And so we wanted to give those students access to really good opportunities. I think we were also, as college students, just aware of the fact that applying for jobs was just an awful process. It was super tough to apply to a company that you thought might get back to you, but then ended up, not even reading your application, and you felt like you were just kind of going into these black holes. And so the whole concept of Ripplematch in the early days was to basically let every student in the country fill out a questionnaire on everything that they cared about, kind of go deeper than the data that you had on LinkedIn. So dive into preferences, where candidates wanted to move after graduation, what they were interested in, and then match them up with companies. And so we ended up building technology that automated a lot of what had kind of gone in to the on-campus recruiting process historically. It was super humble at the start. We made all sorts of mistakes. The early product we rolled out was, basically a glorified Excel spreadsheet, but we were fortunate to have some amazing backers. Kevin Ryan, who was on the board at Yale for a long time and has just been a huge leader in the New York tech scene, ended up leading our seed round. And from there, we've been able to get some special traction, and it's been an amazing journey. So happy to kind of shed whatever light I can on the process and how we're kind of dealing with everything related to COVID at the moment. But that's kind of the early version of the story.
Yeah. So just to take a step back pre-COVID, can you walk through a little bit how you all have attacked the on-campus recruiting problem and worked with companies to kind of change that?
Yeah, so I think the huge problem in the existing on-campus system is companies tend to visit a couple core schools where they'll go on campus, host an information session, but they're not actually accessing the broadest range of candidates for a given position. And so the way that we've kind of taken that problem on is to have companies basically put in everything that they're looking for in candidates, candidates put in everything that they're looking for in companies. And our software almost acts like a human matchmaker in the middle of it. So picture like a supercharged career services office going out to everybody and saying, hey, what do you care about? What do you value? What are you looking for on both sides of the equation, and bringing people together. So that's kind of been the unique take on it. I think that the other thing that we've really just like prioritized in our process is having a really candidate-friendly experience. I think, especially at the entry level, companies have a tendency to treat candidates badly, not get back to them, be really slow to move on them. And we've tried to use a lot of data to basically show companies that if they behave in certain ways, they'll get better results in the process. So a lot of what we do is bring data to really human processes and help both candidates and companies sort of figure out how they mutually succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's really interesting because a lot of the technology companies that I work with are very focused on getting the right candidates in front of them and having a mindset of like, let's make this a quick process, but get the best people. And how do we get access to the best people? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's totally right. And I think like most people are really well-intentioned in the process. It's just tough. If you're a company and you have 25,000 applicants, there's no way that human beings can give those candidates a good experience. And so you need technology to augment everything that these human teams are doing.
Yeah. So could you maybe walk through a little bit how recruiting works for, at least let's talk about the New York market, for the smaller tech companies or the larger companies that you end up working with? Is there a difference in the process?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it really varies, kind of like you're suggesting, depending on the stage of company. I'd say at companies below 30 employees, you almost always have founders heavily involved in the process. And I think that it's rare that, there's sort of a recruiter making a major decision in terms of what's going on. It's typically either very senior leaders within the company or the founders themselves who sort of need to have buy-in in order to get a candidate through. And so I think within that process, there's some really good opportunities for candidates. I think that if you network with the right person, you can have somebody sort of take a chance on you early. I also think that with smaller teams and smaller companies, there's often less of a structure in place, which allows you as a candidate to sort of navigate everything with a little bit more kind of discretion, and you can kind of bend the process to what favors you a little bit more. With bigger companies, it's often much more systematic. If you're interviewing for a MongoDB or a Stripe, there's often layers and layers of approval before you're getting to anyone particularly senior. And so it just sort of changes the approach that you need to take in the process.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about, how you see networking working in this day and age for people out there looking for jobs? I think particularly as the market tends to get a little tighter, how do you advise people?
Yeah, I think networking is still everything. I think that I'm always amazed how many people just submit job applications and sort of think that's enough. I think LinkedIn in particular is actually an incredibly powerful tool when it comes to identifying people who might be able to help you. And I think, I look back at our hires, so many of the people that we've brought into Ripplematch either have come through, our own software, but or have also been referrals from people we know in the community. I think often, if you approach something as a networking chat with the right person, rather than just going straight for an interview, even if it's not a fit for their company, you get the benefit of their knowledge of the broader ecosystem. And so I'm just a huge proponent of shooting people cold emails in general. I've been rejected countless times, but I've also managed to get a few pretty big meetings that have made a big difference. So I think if you have no fear of rejection and you just reach out to people with really thoughtful, personalized messaging, I'm always amazed at, even how really, really busy people are willing to respond and kind of how that can open doors.
Yeah, no, it's something that I think a lot about in my career is kind of changing the dialogue about networking, where it's not just you always asking people, but kind of turning around and offering them advice along the way, or any kind of context that you can have. It's, I think probably how you and I met actually for the first time.
Yeah, I think that's totally right.
So let's talk about I'd like to get your understanding of the recent kind of tech hiring market in New York, how you've been engaging, and pre-COVID, and then kind of leading up to this. Obviously, we'd had a big market uptick, a bunch of IPOs, and companies really at transformative stages, and then we've had this kind of sharp turnaround.
Yeah, it's been quite a contrast. I mean, I think just in general, the last couple of years for New York City tech have been really, really amazing. It's been incredible to see the progress Datadog's had, MongoDB, Jet. I mean, you've just seen this sort of host of New York companies really, I think for the first time, starting to rival what you see out west a little bit in terms of just overall impact and starting to kind of make a major dent on the map. And I think that, at least for us, the year kind of leading up to this was just incredibly hot in terms of hiring and in terms of making sure you sort of could get the right talent, which was incredibly competitive. I think that unfortunately, COVID's changed things pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. I'm not sure how many of you have sort of seen the New York Times graphs that the Upshot's been putting out, just showing unemployment claims rising week over week. But I think what we're going through right now is unfortunately pretty historic. It doesn't mean that the hiring market seized up entirely. I think that for startups that are well capitalized and in good financial positions, I think they're still looking to hire opportunistically, but especially on the sales and marketing side of things, there's definitely been, a significant slowdown.
Yeah, I think that, at least from my client base, one of the exciting things is that some of them have actually been able to close really great rounds and have capital to kind of plan out, and others are, making strategic decisions that are very important and that are going to dictate the future of their business. So I think it's a time to assess and really lay out a plan. So I guess, one thing I'd like to understand is how you work with companies for a hire. Like, what is the cycle? Because that kind of feeds into, I think, how people think about companies coming out and hiring them. Like, are you talking to them a year in advance, a couple months in advance about hiring for the next year, or is it just near-term fixes?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it really depends on company size. So if you're, Pfizer, who we work a lot with, or Dell, you're setting your hiring targets almost 9 months in advance at the entry level. And it's this very planned, very structured process where, unless the economy really starts to go crazy like you're seeing right now, not much kind of changes other than that drawn out planning process. Mm-hmm. Startups are all over the place, I would say. You'll win a couple big deals, you're feeling more confident. Suddenly hiring picks up, especially in the really early stages, stuff can shift quickly. And obviously venture capital dictates what's going on so much. So in the, 3 or 4 months after a round, you see companies basically, on these sort of just hiring's all they're doing, enormous spree. And then as they get towards the end of their runway and they're making every penny count before that next round, you generally see hiring slow a considerable amount.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I hadn't thought about that, but that could be an opportunity for some people right now who are looking for jobs. Find who's made announcements about their latest rounds and attack those companies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's actually interesting. So in 2008, Sequoia Capital released this like very famous deck that was called like RIP Good Times, where they basically sent it to all their founders, and they get a lot of credit for being just like way ahead of the curve. They've sent a few of these decks at other times that haven't panned out all the way, so I don't want to give them like full credit for seeing the future. But what it basically said was, the 2008 financial crisis was going to cause this debt spiral. They called a lot of what was happening with mortgage-backed securities really accurately. And the overall message to their companies was, if you have 12 months of capital, figure out how you make it 18. If you have 6 months of capital, do whatever you have to do to claw it towards 18. And if you have less than 6 months of capital, you're totally done and aren't going to weather this crisis. And it was like this incredibly sort of depressing talk that they both sent out as a deck and gave to a lot of their founders. And it's interesting. They sent out a kind of similar deck for the first time around all of this COVID stuff, maybe not quite as dire as what you saw in 2008. But I think in the venture community, there's significant pressure for startups with less runway to do whatever they can to drag it out. So if you're looking at a startup that's raised funding in the distant past, and it's likely that they have, less than a year of runway left, it's probably not a great time to be reaching out to them unless it's, Zoom or something in the like conference space. But I do think there's a lot of startups that have, 18 months to 2 years of runway that are still investing. They're still growing, maybe a little bit more cautiously. And so I think one strategy I would just definitely advise is like targeting startups that have raised recent big rounds, which is often a good sign of momentum and of just having the financial strength to kind of weather what's going on right now.
So, you are a CEO of a tech venture-backed company. How are you thinking about this with your employees, with your investors? Have your investors been good resources for you?
Yeah, I mean, we've been lucky to have an amazing group of investors backing us. So what I find, and it's funny, is like a young founder, I think this wasn't something that I like immediately was like, oh, that's the right way to handle this. But at this point, I try to just be like as transparent as I possibly can be with our investors. I think it's really important that they understand absolutely everything going on, and they'll work with you to figure it out. So I think the one thing no investor likes is surprises, but most of them understand that there's sort of factors beyond your control going on right now. And so I think the really important thing as you work with investors is just making sure you've got a plan in place that everybody gets, everybody agrees to. You get what needs to happen there. On the employee side of things, I mean, uncertainty like this is tough, right? Like I think one of the reasons that like startups outcompete much bigger companies a lot of the time is it often feels like a family internally and things are really, really close. And I think anytime there's uncertainty about the economic future, you've got to be responsible about making sure you have the right resources and the right team and the right amount of runway. So that can lead to hard trade-offs. But I think that in general with team as well, just being hyper transparent about what's going on and making sure everybody just like understands is probably the single most important thing.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel like you're reanalyzing the situation on a day-by-day basis, or are you trying to have kind of a longer-term perspective on the impact of COVID?
So I think there's sort of two countering like impulses there. On one level, you want to make sure that you're moving incredibly quickly. I think that the companies that survive and thrive in tough times are often the ones that act decisively. So you got to be careful not to get caught moving too slowly. At the same time, there's so much noise in any week's data, and the situation's so dynamic right now. I mean, we don't even know if the stimulus bill that just kind of passed through the Senate is going to end up having a lot of benefits for venture-backed startups, or they're going to be totally cut out. We're trying to see how deals come through at the end of the quarter. So there's this trade-off between wanting to act decisively, but also realizing that you're probably going to be okay in certain areas and wanting to make sure you're not like overreacting given how much is sort of uncertain at the moment too.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. We've been talking to our clients a lot about, the CARES Act and the SBA programs that you just mentioned. And a lot of these things are developing, and some of them may take months for people to apply to. And they could be great resources, but we need to see what actually is signed into law. So I think there's some questions there, and people can get very focused on that when I think, you need to be thinking about this from a number of different angles right now.
Definitely. Yeah, it's been a really interesting day. It's been my first time as a founder actually seeing like something going on in Washington feel like it has a big impact on kind of what's going on. But yeah, I mean, that legislation could very easily cut out venture-backed startups in terms of support
Yeah.
for payroll and keeping employees on, which is, something that's been decided in 12 hours and probably went back and forth between Marco Rubio and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and whoever was like actually working on that deal. But, half of Congress hasn't even read it. The wording's super vague. It's just tough to know exactly, where some of the stuff that has a big impact on the bottom line will pan out. So we'll have to see.
So you're a Yale senior and you don't have a job yet because you were assuming that you could always back into the investment banker consulting job that no longer exists. How do you think about getting a job in this environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be good about not plugging our product too much, but you should totally sign up for Ripplematch because that's what we do and that's what we help students figure out. In terms of just like navigating this process right now, I think the good news is that while there has been some change, some companies have canceled internship programs, some companies have canceled entry-level jobs, there's still a majority of companies that are proceeding with their plans as they were sort of thinking about it. And I think that it definitely has affected smaller companies more than big companies. You've sort of seen that in the fall of both small cap stocks as compared to the S&P and then especially in the startup community. But I think if you're passionate about getting into tech, I would say go work for like a Stripe or an Instacart or some like post-IPO company that still has a lot of that tech feel and a lot of those tech best practices, but is maybe less vulnerable to the market forces going on right now just because they're growing really quickly. And it's probably tougher for boutique consulting firms. But if you're trying to work for one of the bigger firms, they're probably going to be all right for the short term at least. So I don't know. I think the key is just like continuing to do the right networking, continue to putting in. It makes it harder, but there's still a lot of good opportunities open that I think college seniors have access to.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The other thing to think about is, what is your timeline, right? How much do you need a job right away? Can you take on something like go help out on a part-time basis at a tech company? See if Ripplematch needs an intern or something along those lines.
Totally. And one thing I will say is, if you're feeling more idealistic and have considered the nonprofit sector at all, there's still a ton of really great nonprofits hiring a lot who are a little less affected by short-term economic downturns. I know Success Academy, who we work with, is hiring a ton right now. Pretty cool place to start a career as a teacher. And there's just some really Venture for America, another company doing a lot of cool stuff right now. So there's some good options too if you're trying to go nonprofit.
Yeah. Kind of taking a step back. I mean, what do you think? I know obviously you don't have your magic 8-ball in front of you, but like, how are you thinking about pushing people in the fall? Like, are you going to be attacking the schools in the same way? How are you starting to plan around that?
Yeah, so I think for us, like so much of our mission is making sure that companies are able to hire candidates that represent the communities that they serve, which means that even though Ripplematch like originally kind of took off in the Ivy League and has really good adoption at sort of US News top 50 schools, we've sort of gotten enough of a foothold there that a lot of our focus is expanding into new areas. So we've been doing a lot of partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities, working a lot with HSIs. I think the Midwest is an area that often gets really overlooked for talent. It's funny, we have a lot of California students on the platform, and the problem is that nobody that lives in California wants to leave California, so they don't relocate. But if you're living, in Dearborn, Michigan, or you're living in Ohio or wherever it might be, you're open to other really good jobs, both within the Midwest and the broader country. So, we've been doing a lot of kind of expansion within states that I think have traditionally been a little bit missed by the economic boom, but have really awesome candidates that are, open to jobs all over the country and kind of helping getting them connected with the right opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we have some founders on the line, and particularly some people who are at an early stage or at inception. I was just speaking to a founder yesterday who actually said this is a great moment for them because they haven't built up a team. They're really going to be able to kind of knuckle down and build out a strategy. But any advice for founders as they think about like how to build their business in a tough time?
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that if you're in the phase of the business where it's all about product development and you're just kind of figuring out like what you can build, this is a great time. Like hunker down and just build. I think that's an awesome place to be in. I think for us, one thing that's totally unaffected by all of this is our product roadmap, and it's a great time to kind of lean in and play a little bit of offense there because there's some great opportunities. One thing I will say is, with where the VC community is right now, I would try to avoid needing to raise capital in the next 12 months, which means that kind of being ramen profitable. I think Paul Graham always talks about like the milestone in early startup life being if you can just, live on a really cheap amount of money and just kind of like grind it out. I think this is a good time for that. I think having to go out, in 6 months compared to in a year could mean the difference in, like 2x difference in valuation, just because VC will really start to open up, I think, once the economy rebounds. And so I just be really disciplined about spending money and build on product like crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that being said, there is money out there. Like we've had kind of an amazing cycle where there have been venture funds that have been raised. There have been a tremendous amount of kind of exits where people are now coming back in the wonderful cycle of now becoming angel investors, starting their first fund or things like that, where I think there are going to be some opportunities and people who want to like show some value, like just as people are looking at the stock market and seeing depressed valuations offering an opportunity. I think that there is going to be an opportunity to come in with low cap convertible notes or a early stage round where people can have more of an ownership stake in the company that they might not have been able to negotiate 6 months ago.
Yeah, I think on the angel side of things, that's a good point. There's definitely a lot of opportunities. I think institutionally, I think VCs tend to think a little bit like each other, although there's some great exceptions to that rule. Yeah. And so I think that you've seen more of a slowdown there, but on the angel side, it's very, very wide open. And I would continue to think there'd be a lot of opportunity at the super early stages.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting how it plays out. You have VCs like Fred Wilson saying, like, we're actively looking at new term sheets and moving things forward. But, then you also have people that I'm speaking to are saying, we really want to have reserves to invest in our clients. And I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. If companies take the Sequoia method and say, we're battening down the hatches, we're not going to need money for 18 months, these funds still need to show successful investment. So like, are they actually going to keep encouraging that? So it's going to be an interesting topic for another webinar of ours.
Yeah, definitely. It's gonna be interesting to see where that goes.
So I guess any, trends in hiring or any sectors that you think are really interesting for people to be staring at this time?
I think what you're seeing is the companies that you would think would do well during the coronavirus outbreak are indeed doing well during the coronavirus outbreak. I don't know what percentage of the world has gotten introduced to Zoom in the last, 2 weeks, but it's probably been a surprisingly high percentage. Instacart is doing really well. All the sort of food delivery options are doing really well. And then I think it's actually been, a pretty good time for big tech when you look at Netflix, you look at Facebook, you look at Google. All of these companies, I think, are weathering the storm a lot more than more kind of, traditional sectors within the economy. And I think that's partly because they have technology that's like naturally suited to lots of people being home. But I also think it's an ability to adapt quickly, an ability to shift quickly. I think there's a reason that that tech has done sort of so well across the board recently. And I would sort of expect that trend to continue. Obviously not a good time if you're trying to start your career in the airline industry, but maybe the stimulus bill will help.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is a really interesting time. I think, kind of forecasting what sectors could do really well in this. It's hard to know, but I think there are some opportunities there nonetheless.
Definitely. And I think the world's also just shifting to such a more kind of remote, interconnected place. I think anything that has to do with remote work, I think there's a lot of companies realizing right now that the world doesn't collapse because everybody's not next to each other and in their monitors all day, and that stuff's actually kind of working okay remote. And so I think you'll start to see an acceleration around technology that enables that across the board.
Yeah, I mean, so jumping back to that a little bit, did you have companies hiring remote workers before, or do you think that's going to be kind of a trend going forward?
Yeah, so we have a few customers that hire remote, but I'd say 90% of our customers don't hire remote. Part of that is when somebody's just out of college, you kind of like to keep an eye on them and make sure they're not, doing what I think you start to see it mature. But I think within the startup community, it's been this major divide, right? Like, I think it's kind of core to like founder psychology. Like, I will have remote people or I won't have remote people. And I think that what we're increasingly seeing is, one, it's just not sustainable to build massive sales teams in San Francisco or New York because the cost of living so high, and you can go build a team in Provo, Utah, or Denver, or wherever. Yeah. And you can, get equivalent talent a lot cheaper. That said, I personally think you lose a lot, especially on the engineering and product side, not having people collaborating every day and being in the same place. But I know there's founders who would disagree and have built very successful companies remotely too.
So, I mean, does that make you rethink, as a CEO of a company at all, how you might allow for some remote work or anything along those lines?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my attitude on remote work has definitely gotten a lot more relaxed over time. I think it works really efficiently in sales organizations because everybody has a target anyway. And so it's easy to kind of track what's going on. And I think for your senior people who you trust, I mean, maybe they have kids they need to drop off. Maybe they love to go to the gym on Wednesday morning and then come into work and they can work a little bit. And I think part of being a good leader is just trusting that your people are going to perform and figure it out on their own schedule. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say I'm probably the worst at accepting this culture. Like, as an attorney, I like to have the associates down the hall. I love the idea of being able to walk by people's offices. But we're being forced to adopt this, and I think there's some really interesting ways that we can approach this in a smart way to build culture even while you're in a remote moment. Like, we've been actually running a book club among my associates just to kind of like run things forward and have some connectivity.
That's awesome. Yeah, we've been doing these like sort of wacky like team happy hours where we have everybody like dress up in weird costumes for the meeting, which just kind of lightens it a little bit. And I've been doing kind of lunch and learns where people teach on a subject that they're passionate about that has nothing to do with work. And so, yeah, I think there's cool ways people can connect remotely. I personally like miss being in there day to day with our team, but I also think it makes me a little bit more receptive to, at least partially working remote in different circumstances.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that's going to develop, or that, we need to kind of understand, is how do you actually create boundaries on your day? Like, to me, some of this has been great in that I can go for a walk in the afternoon or something like that. But also, I feel like I'm paying more attention to my phone at 11 o'clock rather than that, when I was in the office and kind of walking out of the office and, having a little bit of distance.
I was talking about that with my girlfriend. Yeah, we were saying that like the couch had become this just like blend of work and movies, and there was no sort of separation between the two, and starting to go pretty stir crazy. So I think even things like changing up physical space, being really disciplined about there actually being an end to the day, like some of those things are really easy to lose when you're working remotely, and it's taken at least me a little while to like get the hang of it and start to figure it out a little more.
Yeah. So I think we're heading towards the Q&A session, Wendy, and want to be kind of disciplined about that. But cheers, Andrew, to making it to this part of the webinar. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. So we're now going to open the floor to Q&A. Our first question is from Ellen Ryan. Hi, Ellen. Here is her question for Andrew. Andrew, have you considered also serving mid or second career candidates who are reinventing themselves or who may have been laid off?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and probably the single biggest request we get from customers, I think, as we think about our long-term vision. We'd love to sort of take hiring head on across the board. And we do have a lot of support for what boot camps are doing, especially in the coding space. So I think there's some really cool opportunities right now in the middle of your career to relearn and then start at the entry level. And we've started thinking a lot about how we kind of incorporate boot camp grads, especially in the tech side, into what we're doing. I think, unfortunately for us, our algorithms rely on a lot of customization to the entry-level space, and so we get less good from a technology perspective as we get further on in careers. My hope is that one day we'll be able to do it all, but at the moment, we just don't have the bandwidth and try to be really good at one thing, which is kind of the entry level.
Excellent. Okay. We are, I'm surprised I don't have more questions teed up in the Q&A box, but go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, Andrew, I think it is an interesting thing to think through, like as people go through the cycle, like how do you grow with them as a recruiting firm? And I think, it's interesting because I know that there are a lot of people who kind of attack the higher end, and then there's a broad swath who are kind of going after the world. Like the number of law firm recruiting requests I get on a daily basis are pretty tremendous. But would be interested to hear how is there anyone else you think who's doing a good job in the recruiting space and attacking this, or are you guys just the only good people out there?
No, I think there's some other companies that are doing this in really, really creative, good ways. I think AngelList is an awesome company, especially if you're trying to find a job within tech. Their whole thing is, basically they're everything when it comes to startups and finding jobs and finding capital. They sort of have two sides of the business, but the whole concept there, I just think is really, really good. I think if you're trying to do something a little bit different, or you're switching careers, or it's maybe not a direct transition, I think going small company, where companies are often open to really good people, even if they don't have all the necessary qualifications, is a really, really good opportunity. I think that in general, LinkedIn is obviously the kind of status quo, but I think a tool that can be used really, really effectively. I think my biggest frustration, though, with tools in general is that there's often not a focus on matching and connecting really well. And I think often candidates are a little lost and need to be guided through the process. And so a lot of how we think about building our technology is kind of shepherding people along rather than kind of pushing them out to do it all themselves.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that that companies should be taking a different approach to their targeted kind of marketing about their culture, their mission, and kind of how they're recruiting in this time? Because obviously they're not going to big career fairs. They're maybe having to use tech more or LinkedIn.
Yeah, I think they're just seeing a huge change. So right now you have 2 million college students in the United States that can't access career services. They can't access on-campus fairs. The entire landscape has kind of shifted overnight because no one can physically be in these college campuses. And so I think the companies that win the best talent in this environment will be the ones that shift really rapidly to a digital strategy, that are able to provide a really good candidate experience virtually, that use video and content to kind of paint a really good feel for what the companies actually like, because their candidates aren't able to come in for in-person interviews. And so I think it's all about kind of taking advantage of virtual tools really quickly. And that's a huge surge that we're just kind of seeing across the board right now.
Okay, so I have a couple questions here. Hooray. Sam Hendel. Sam would like to know if you have noticed any major changes in job openings in the past few weeks, Andrew. And specifically, have you noticed any changes in specific sectors or any particular job types, such as engineering, sales, marketing?
Yeah, so I have a few different friends who kind of work at sort of job sites closer to what's going on in the startup community right now. I think you've seen just massive decline in job postings, which is not unexpected given the kind of messaging that's been coming out from most VCs at the moment. So we've seen a big shift there. We've personally seen probably 25% of customers either cut or modify their internship program substantially. One bright spot, though, I will say, is engineering hiring continues to be as hot and competitive as ever. If you have an engineering background, it is still a great time to get into tech. I think, unfortunately, the brunt of the sort of decline in hiring has fell in sales and marketing and stuff more related that's variable to the kind of, go-to-market side of these company operations.
Yeah, Andrew, have you seen any shifts in kind of and I know this is an unlimited time frame, like the offers that people are receiving? Do you all look at those offers or coach people on what they're receiving?
So yeah, we haven't seen companies adjust the amount of money going out in offers yet. It feels very much like an all or nothing kind of approach. And I think most companies are kind of keeping their core plan in place with offers. So we haven't seen a big shift there.
Okay.
All right, I have a couple questions from Joel Pearson. Andrew, for graduating students who do not yet have something lined up, or for those who are still seeking internships, do you see pitching small or medium-sized firms on project work for a summer job or something near term? Do you think that's something that might work in this environment?
Yeah, I think project work can be a really good way to get your foot in the door. And honestly, you'd be surprised if you can just like show up to work at enough startups day after day and provide value, you'll probably eventually get hired. And so I love the sort of ethos behind that. I think breaking in to tech is so often about just like hustle and perseverance, and those things really matter. The only sort of caveat I'd have is make sure that the work you're doing is actually for someone who can truly advocate for you within a company. You don't want to be working for some junior analyst who doesn't have any sway. If you're doing a summer of discounted or part-time work, I think you want to make sure you're really working with a decision maker at the company.
Good answer. Okay, Jessica Sun has a question for you, Andrew. I understand that you focus on entry level. What would be your advice for career pivoting for experienced candidates, especially in product manager roles of growing tech sectors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think like being a product manager, number one, is an amazing job. And I think for so many people who are both analytical and creative, like the kind of thing that they most want to be doing, and definitely something I'd encourage people to pursue. I think it also makes it a challenging field to break into. I think that one thing that I would definitely recommend is just kind of getting abreast of technical skills if you don't have them already. I think really good SQL knowledge is definitely an advantage. I know that General Assembly and a number of sort of different companies in New York offer really good training there. And so I think the more you can kind of build your technical skill set. And then I just think being flexible is a really good thing. If you get to a startup that just raised their seed funding round or whatever, and there's only 10 people there, even if your title's product analyst when you start or operations, if you're persistent and kind of keep angling and have a natural instinct for product, you can kind of work your way into a quasi PM role and then a full-time PM role pretty quickly. So I think that's definitely a cool thing to be able to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've actually seen that interestingly with my sister who works at an ed tech company. And Maggie kind of came in with that education background and has been able to pivot to a PM because she kind of built up technical chops along with kind of really understanding how the product works. And I think that, there could be, if you're pivoting, there could be easier pivots and easier companies to get into if it's, building on some of the skills that you already have.
Totally. I think one thing on that note that sometimes gets a little bit neglected is I think people often think of sales and product as being two distinct things, and they really want to be on the kind of technical product side of the organization. But being a good product thinker is all about understanding the user. And I think that if you start on the account management or customer success side of things and just listen really carefully and then build relationships with existing product managers or engineers, it can actually be a kind of good way to break in on the product side of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question here. This question comes from Grace CA, who is one of the Accelerate Yale founders. What steps do you recommend for someone who is currently interviewing for a new role in tech, particularly if the companies that they're interviewing with have placed the process on hold?
Yeah, that's a good question and a super relevant one right now, unfortunately. So I think there's, one side of it, which is it's tough. Like if a startup's put hiring on hold, stuff may rebound pretty aggressively in 3 to 4 months, or it could be, 12 months before there's any movement. I think it's always tough. Like you eventually have to move on. And if a company is not hiring, it can be tough to break in. On the flip side, don't burn those relationships though, because in a funny way, if stuff changes really quickly, I think it could actually benefit you a lot. I think what you'll see is companies are going to kind of foolishly clear out their whole pipelines. And then when stuff starts clicking again, they'll hire really quickly. And so if you're able to kind of stay in touch, build the relationship, even if you start to look at other jobs, let them know you're still interested. I think being top of mind if this does shift suddenly has some potential advantages for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have a relationship with someone at the company, checking in every once in a while and saying like, it's kind of interesting. This is what I'm seeing in the marketplace. How are you guys thinking about this? Not just do you have a job for me yet? Because you have to realize that a lot of these founders have pressures on them and they'd probably like to hire you, but you want to change that dialogue so that's not just, oh, it's another email from Adam, asking when I can start.
I think that's totally right. And I think it's easy to view things transactionally in some ways. And if you don't get the job, you just drop off the face of the earth. But so much of this is just about relationships and sticking with it and, following up in nice, non-annoying ways. So yeah, I totally agree.
We don't have any questions right now in the queue. Adam, do you have anything you wanted to, any other burning questions you had for Andrew? Or Andrew, was there anything you actually really wanted to convey to this particular audience about your journey as a founder, about this moment in time, and what this represents for you as a company? What opportunities do you see for Ripplematch from here?
I think the big thing on our side that I would just say is one, if you are a college student right now looking for a job or in the first couple of years of your career, we'd love to help you. I think we take a lot of pride in having the best candidate experience on the market, and we have a lot of companies that are still hiring and are still really looking for talent across product, across sales, across marketing, across analyst positions. And so it's still a good time to find a job. And I think you've just got to work a little bit harder and be a little bit better. But I think I would sort of end on a little bit of a note of optimism. I know I've been talking about how hard the startup community is getting hit by everything. And I think that's true, but it also doesn't mean, that you can't find a great job right now. So that's just like one thing I'd echo. And then number two is just like, I don't know. I think like we've talked about a bunch tonight, and there's been a range of topics, but I think the importance of just like networking really well and reaching out to people is a really great thing to kind of emphasize. I think it's so easy to be either like feeling isolated or to be too direct about what you're going for. But I often find just like building relationships with people you think are interesting end up paying off 6 months down the line, even if they don't pay off right away. And it's kind of a cool thing to be doing. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, Andrew. I graduated law school in 2010 and started my summer associateship in 2009. And when I was applying for those jobs, it was right in the heart of the last economic crisis. And I remember just being like, how do I approach this? But I kind of turned every single conversation into let me understand your market, let me think about what I can do. And do you know someone who maybe would want to talk to me because these are my interests? And I think that this is a moment where you can start thinking like that.
Definitely.
I have a question here from Ellen Ryan again. She asks, how should a candidate leverage LinkedIn?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think like 99% of the world does not leverage LinkedIn nearly as well as it can be leveraged. It's such a powerful tool. I think that there's two ways that you can use LinkedIn that are really powerful. I think one is just like, especially if it's in the context of the job search, identifying like who the decision makers are that you want to get to know and just reaching out to them directly with a really good personalized email. The way that like outbound sales organizations operate is they do something called prospecting, typically where you look at somebody's background and then you send like a really nice, like customized email. It's pretty straightforward to be like, smiled reading that you had this experience here and this experience here. It's so cool. You also went to Yale. I was in Davenport or whatever it is. But like just that little bit of like customization at the start of reach outs to people makes the communication different than 90% of what you get. And you can feed that into like a really nice template that you're sending around to everyone. But I think just like really using personalization, and then this takes time to build, but if you just add everybody you ever meet on LinkedIn at some point, and then you're able to like look at people and see like, oh, I have 7 mutual connections with this person or whatever. Warm intros can be really helpful. And so I think that's just like a good practice that ends up making LinkedIn a kind of powerful tool over time too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been able to use LinkedIn actually, when thinking about pitching clients or when thinking about hiring people at our firm. Like you just want to understand how deep their network is, and if there's someone who has like 2 connections, then you're kind of saying, why aren't they at all thinking about this? I think it's a get you in the door tool rather than a get you a job tool.
For sure. And I think the other thing on LinkedIn that I just find useful is it's sometimes cool to see people's journeys. Like, I guess going back to the question about like breaking in as a product manager, I sometimes like will like look at like, okay, if I want to do something, here's like 10 people who've done it before. And then you can kind of see the different paths and you can start to pattern match in terms of what you might need to do yourself, which I think in a weird way can be inspiring because you start to see that certain people have had really like disjointed, weird paths, and you don't necessarily need to have the same cookie cutter mold as everybody, but also gives you a kind of roadmap for what you might need to do to be in the position you ultimately want to be in.
Yeah, I think it's a fun way also, I will always open up someone's LinkedIn profile more than sometimes even looking at their resume, just to kind of see what they put on there, where their path has been. Did they spend a year somewhere crazy, climbing mountains or something like that?
For sure.
Andrew, do you have any ideas around ways that the universities themselves, and we'll put Yale in the crosshairs, how universities themselves can bring themselves into this century to make the recruiting more effective for the students who are entering the job market? And you can talk about how Ripplematch could maybe play a role in there or not, but obviously you started this company because you saw an opportunity there. What can places like Yale do to make this process easier and more fruitful for both the students who are looking for employment as well as the employers who are looking for that talent?
Yeah, definitely. I think career services offices do have an important role to play in all of this. And I think that the sort of like single biggest thing there, I think, is just like rethinking assumptions. Like if you have 30% of your class going into consulting and investment banking every single year, it could mean that consulting and investment banking are the be all end all, but it might also mean that you need more options on campus, right? So there's like a huge range of, I think, like just being really receptive to like, are we changing? Is everybody kind of doing the same thing that they were 10 years ago, and just being forward thinking? I actually think Yale has one of the better career services offices in the country. I think they're pretty committed to their students and do a pretty good job kind of thinking through stuff. I think for us though, the thing that no career services office can do that we've really like built Ripplematch to solve is eliminate geographic barriers. And I think unfortunately, the very concept of needing to go to a particular school means that opportunities are limited to a smaller subset of candidates who in most good jobs are coming from a series of really good schools. And so you box out these like amazing candidates who are both more likely to accept the offer, more likely to stay in the offer, and often just as smart as the students from these more elite schools. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to do with Ripplematch is say, hey, an opening should really be available to candidates on 1,000 campuses, not just 5. And if you have technology that can kind of transcend geography, you'll end up getting a much better class, and it'll actually look a lot more like the community you serve. So I think career services definitely like have a role, but I also think the sort of monopoly they've had on the process has boxed out students from less prestigious schools in a way that hasn't been particularly fair or productive.
Yeah, are you seeing any schools kind of outside of Yale that have kind of dynamic career services?
Michigan does a great job. I don't know if it's just because they're in Michigan and need to do a great job, but they're really like forward thinking. They do a lot of like really, really cool stuff. I think a lot of community colleges actually do a great job. I think for certain schools, they're able to like rest on the like laurels of their students a little bit. So if you're, whatever Ivy League school, you maybe don't need to have as strong of like a career services office. But if you're at like, I don't know, like some like Aurora Community College, or even if you're at like Rutgers, often those career services offices are like there for their students and they're determined to get them jobs. And so they're a lot more like proactive about establishing, connections with companies and trying new technologies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm hoping that actually this could be a moment where, different career services programs can not only just work with Ripplematch, but also view this as a time where they can be proactive, where they can be problem solving for the students graduating and saying like, what are you actually passionate about? You shouldn't be putting all your eggs in a basket and getting a job at Goldman just because you may want something else, and also that opportunity may be very hard to get.
Definitely. And I will say that like so many of my friends, I feel like are like, somewhere between like 3 and 5 years into their career right now. And they're realizing the thing they thought they wanted to do was totally not the thing that they thought they wanted to do. And so I think one other thing I just say is like, it's okay to be wrong. And I think some of the early parts of your career are about figuring out what you like and what you don't like. But if you hate your job or it doesn't feel right, like get out and change quickly, because there's other opportunities out there. And I think too many people, realize at age 35 that they've been working a job that, wasn't totally what they were passionate about or wanted.
I know you somehow find yourself, a partner at a law firm and around there for a little while.
We have about 5 minutes left, so why don't we start to wind things down? Adam, did you have another question?
Well, I don't have anything specific, but I think, on a lighter note, Andrew, have you watched anything recently that's been great and surprised you?
That's a good question. I'd say that, like, for me at least, as like a young founder, like, in a funny way, podcasts have been like the great equalizer. It's amazing how, like, I still, like, to me is like a totally insane concept how you can just like pop into a living room with like the smartest person in like a given area and just hear them talk. I think Naval Ravikant at AngelList has like a great podcast where he reflects on a lot of like what's going on in life. I know Tim Ferriss gets a fair amount of flack, some of it well deserved, but I think some of his interviews with really interesting people are great. I always like How I Built This. So I think, like, in general, podcasts have been a cool resource. And then just like books. I'm a huge book nerd. So
yeah, on the podcast front, like, I think one of the best out there, and it's amazing he's kind of kept it relevant, is 20-Minute VC, which are always longer than 20 minutes. But Harry Stebbings over there has done some really interesting stuff, and he approaches it. He talks to CVCs, he speaks to LPs, and you can really get an understanding of the venture market in that way. On another note, I actually had never introduced anyone in my family to the Birdcage, and we watched that for the first time, and I have to tell you, the Birdcage holds up as a movie and is pretty wonderful like 20 years later.
I'll have to check it out. I'd also say too, this is like a little bit more industry specific, but if you're like a B2B founder or just trying to get into B2B tech, Jason Lemkin's blog is like so accessible and so good and just like really, really helpful. So totally recommend that.
Yeah, and I mean, at this point, I will say we're in one of the greatest worlds for VC writing. I think, people are writing really thoughtful pieces. Brad Feld over at Foundry has been writing some really great stuff. Mark Suster always writes some really interesting stuff. And Fred Wilson writes every single day, and he can still make it really interesting.
Yeah, Fred Wilson and Brad Feld are both great. And Andreessen Horowitz has like amazing resources on like marketplace dynamics, and they get super technical in terms of all sorts of weird and interesting stuff. So some of the thinkers they have over there, I really think are like some of the, kind of smartest minds on this stuff and write lots of great content because it's how they get leads now. So I totally agree. It's the era for good VC content.
Awesome. All right, well, why don't we wrap things up for this evening? First of all, I wanted to thank you, Andrew, for such a fun, interesting conversation tonight. We really appreciate you spending an hour of your time tonight with us and the members of the Accelerate Yale community. Adam, thank you so much for keeping the conversation going and so engaging. And what I wanted to just share with all of our participants is that we will be doing more webinars. We have another webinar coming up on Monday night with Dr. Stephen Choi, who is really overseeing all the COVID efforts in the Yale New Haven network, and will be advising, I believe he's the co-chair of a task force on COVID in Connecticut. So that will be this coming Monday night, so please tune in for that. Also, you can check us out online. We're at accelerateyale.org, and you can also find Yale Angels at yaleangels.org. You can find us on LinkedIn at Accelerate Yale. Just type that in, and you can see our company page, and you can also find us on Facebook. We have our own kind of community page on Facebook, and that's where we articles of interest as well as post notices about upcoming events and webinars. So, and don't forget to sign up for our mailing list, and you can do that on accelerateyale.org's page. Just go into the upper right hand corner and click join, and you can just fill in your email address and name there. So, we would just want to thank everybody for spending the evening with us. We hope that it was a distraction from everything else that's going on out there in the world right now, and that you found it just as fun and engaging as we did. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thanks, Wendy.
Cheers. Bye. Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you, and Adam.
Thanks,
All right,
Andrew.
bye. All right. Bye-bye.